Okay, so we're going to talk about the cardiovascular system, which includes the heart, the blood, and the blood vessels. But we're going to have to break this into a bunch of parts. So I'm going to start with part one, in which we'll be looking at the structure of the heart. And then this is very important, something you have to know, and that is how blood flows through the heart, and that includes through which valves, into which, whether it's the aorta, the pulmonary artery, pulmonary vein, vena cava, and so how it's getting back to the heart. We don't have to know all the blood vessels through the body, but just kind of where it goes and how it's leaving the heart. So as it pertains to the heart. So we're going to have to know and understand all of this because there will be a lot of questions on it. And then we'll talk about the valves. We're going to identify them, talk about their role, which is really just to have one-way flow, so it keeps blood from flowing backwards. And then how those actually relate to sounds, because it's actually the closing of the valves that creates the heart sounds that you can hear with a stethoscope. So to start talking about the heart, we know that it's going all the time. So your heart has to be beating all the time. You're constantly pumping blood to your cells to give them nutrients, to give them, in particular, oxygen, and to remove carbon dioxide. So we want to get rid of carbon dioxide. So that's what's constantly going on. So it beats over 100,000 times per day. And of course, everybody has a little bit different heart rate, but nonetheless, everybody's heart is extremely busy all the time. And so it's structured and it's made for that purpose, to keep beating all the time efficiently and always to work. Okay? So that's kind of an important thing. Okay, so it's located behind the sternum, a little bit to the left. And if you've ever, said the Pledge of Allegiance or something like that, you put your hand on your heart, and it's always a little bit on the left side. So I think most of us know that. In fact, the left lung has a notch out of it where the heart has to sit. So the left lung is actually a little bit smaller and has one fewer lobe than the right lung because it has to make room for the heart. Okay, it has four chambers. Four chambers. Okay, the human heart, most mammals have a four-chambered heart. Two of these are the atria. So there's the right atrium, and just like in a person, if you were looking at this person, you would say that that's their right hand. So this is the right side of their heart, and this is their left hand, their left arm. So that's the left side. Okay, so this is the left atrium and the right atrium over here. Okay, right atrium, left atrium. And the only thing the atria do, and this will help when you're trying to figure out where blood is flowing, the only thing the atria do is to pump blood. They squeeze and they pump blood to the ventricles. Okay? Both of them squeeze at the same time and they pump blood to the ventricles. And those are the other two chambers of the heart. Okay? The ventricles. So the ventricles then receive the blood from the atria. Okay? And yes, they look a little bigger because a lot of blood just flows in there. But we're not too concerned about that. We just want to know that the blood is coming from the atria to the ventricles. Okay? And then from the ventricles, it will actually flow either through, in this case, from the left side, it goes through the aorta. And from the right side, it goes off here through the pulmonary artery to the lungs. Okay? Okay, so that's also part of what you're going to have to know. So this one, so if we focus just for a second on, and I can even make it blue to show that it's deoxygenated, deoxygenated blood flows from the right ventricle through the pulmonary artery, because an artery goes away from the heart, and a vein goes to the heart. Okay, so that's something you need to know. We'll talk about it again, but it's good to know right now. If it's an artery, it goes away from the heart. If it's a vein, it goes toward the heart. Now, so this is the pulmonary, and the other thing that's good to know is that pulmonary refers to lungs. Okay, so we can see up here pulmonary veins, which are probably going to the heart, and here's the pulmonary artery that we're talking about right now. So pulmonary means it's going to the lungs, and it's an artery, so it's going away from the heart. So that's what's happening here. Is this is pushing blood away from the heart through the pulmonary veins, and it goes to the lung, goes to the left lung and the right lung, where it gets oxygen. Now on the other side, we have oxygenated blood that's in here, and at the same time that both of these ventricles are contracting at the same time, this is pushing blood through the aorta, and it's going everywhere. It's going to the legs, to the head, and then it descends down and it goes to the lower body, and it goes all the way through your system. Okay, and it even branches at one point to give the heart itself blood, because remember, the heart's a muscle, so it needs blood, and those are the coronary arteries. Okay, so we'll go through this step by step again. But this is just kind of an overview of everything that's happening. And then if we look at this graph over here, we can see again that what ends up happening is there's a septum, okay, first of all, dividing all of this, and this septum separates the left and the right. You may have heard of a septal defect or a hole in the heart where sometimes the septum doesn't get completely formed and it leaks blood from one side to the other. And so you have oxygenated and deoxygenated blood mixing. But you have on the left side, you have oxygenated blood. Okay, so if you remember that the left side has the oxygen, then you can sort of say, well, okay, since the ventricle is either squeezing to the lungs or to the body, well, on the left side, it must be going to the body because it's taking all of that oxygen and it's distributing it, it's distributing it to cells that are all through your body. All of your cells all over the body need these need oxygen, and they're giving up or they're taking that oxygen, they're giving up carbon dioxide, and so they give up, and so now you have deoxygenated blood. It still has oxygen in it, but it has less, that goes up and moves through, and then it will go back to the right side, which is the deoxygenated side. And then it's deoxygenated, so the right ventricle says, okay, well, we're deoxygenated, so we need to go to the lungs here to pick up oxygen, and then it repeats the whole thing over. So essentially what you see is you see two pumps. You see one that's going out to the body, and we call that systemic. Okay, this is in blue, but it's going to have oxygen. Okay, and then we have the pulmonary, and the pulmonary always refers to lungs. Pulmonary. And that's going to be deoxygenated, that goes to the lungs, then it picks up its oxygen, and it goes back to the left side. And you can see already that sort of a pattern starting to fill that we can kind of make sense about. Okay, so, and we'll come back and we'll talk about it specifically again. Okay, so the heart is composed mostly of myocardium. Myo means muscle, okay? So myocardium means heart, cardio means heart, and muscle. So heart muscle, that's what myocardium is, and when we call it the myocardium. So if you ever heard of a myocardial infarction, well, that's when you get starvation, because remember, we have these coronary arteries that are coming down here, bringing blood to the heart, and if one of those gets blocked or something, then we lose blood flow, and we call that a coronary or a myocardial infarction. So that means that the heart muscle isn't getting oxygen and it's causing death or damage to that tissue. Okay, it's surrounded by a pericardial membrane, so it's separated from the rest of the body, and it has this pericardial membrane. It's called a serous. It's a serous type of membrane, which means that it's secreting a lubricating fluid, so this heart can contract and expand, and it moves all over the place inside there, and that reduces the friction. So it keeps it separated from other organs, and it allows it to move because it's lubricated. So that's the pericardium, or the pericardial membrane. That's what we call that. And then I already mentioned the septum that divides the left side and the right side. So here we've talked about muscle, and I said that we would discuss more of cardiac muscle later on, and which we're doing. And so the difference between cardiac muscle versus skeletal muscle, well, both are striated. Okay, remember the striations. Striations run this way, not this way. Okay, so those are the striations we're talking about. We're talking about the sarcomeres being lined up, and they work in the same way. You have the actin with the myosin heads walking along, okay, pulling it and shortening the sarcomere. So they work in the same way that skeletal muscle works, but there are differences because it's so specialized for what it's doing. One of those differences is if you look here, you can see that it's actually kind of branched. Okay, it's branched, whereas skeletal muscle would be very, very long. Okay, of course it has the striations. It'd be very long. It also has multiple nuclei. So skeletal muscle, just make sure I'm being clear here, this is a skeletal muscle cell, and it has multiple nuclei. Not so with cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle, or myocardia, have one nucleus per cell, and it's branched. Okay, so so that's a difference. Skeletal muscle is multinucleated. Now, something else is that myocardia, heart muscle cell, have something called intercalated discs, and you see this on tests all the time, general knowledge tests and stuff like that, maybe on the T's test, I don't know. But we hear about this all the time. What's something that's cardiac muscle has that skeletal muscle doesn't have? And the answer is intercalated discs. Well, what's an intercalated disc? Well, an intercalated disc is, and I'll try to come up with a little bit different color. Intercalated just means that it goes in and out like this. Okay, so it's intercalated. It isn't just a straight line. It goes in and out. And so when two cardiac muscle cells join up, they have to join very, very tightly, right? Because that cardiac muscle is working all the time. You don't want it to just fall apart. And so this intercalation adds surface area, and then there are junctions that hold it together. And so it's very tightly bound. Okay? And so that's what an intercalated disc is. And if you look at this through a microscope, and anatomists are the ones that discovered it, and they named it, and they said, oh, this is kind of different. And so you can see these intercalated discs. Now, I'm going to erase this, actually, and start over, because there's something else that's important about these intercalated discs. And that is that they have something in them called gap junctions. Okay, so these are those gaps I left were on purpose. And so they have gap junctions in them. And so, yes, they're joined together, but they have these hollowed out junctions. Kind of made that one a little bit big. And so they're holding it together, but at the same time, look what they do. They actually share their cytoplasm. So that means that fluid can flow through and be shared between these individual muscle cells. Okay, so there's one muscle cell, the intercalated disc, connecting it to the next. Okay, so you can kind of imagine another one being joined up here and being connected. Okay, but the inside of the cytoplasm of this one is actually shared with this one. Now, if we think about what happens with a depolarization type of event, remember, sodium rushes in, depolarizes the cell, and then potassium rushes out and repolarizes the cell. It happens with skeletal muscle, it happens with neurons, and it happens with cardiac muscle or myocardia. Okay, so that means, so let's think about what that might mean. Well, what it might mean is that when this sodium rushes in, it will actually rush in over here too, which will depolarize this one, which kind of keeps the depolarization going. So that means that if any muscle cell, any cell of the myocardia depolarizes, they all will depolarize. They work as one unit. Okay, that's important, okay, because your muscles don't necessarily do that. Your skeletal muscles don't necessarily do that. You can pick how many you want to contract and how many you don't want to contract. Okay, that doesn't work with cardiac muscle. All of the atria, okay, it is separated between the atria and the ventricle. All of the atria will depolarize all at the same time, and then there's a pause. And then all of the ventricles will depolarize all at the same time, or all of the ventricular myocardia, okay, the muscle cells of the ventricles. And so all of it depolarizes at the same time, first the atria, and then the ventricles, okay? And it's because of, and yes, I guarantee there'll be a test question on this, it's because of these gap junctions, okay? And they give that connection by sharing the cytosol or the fluid inside the cells. Okay, a couple other differences that are less significant. The T tubules are larger and branched, okay? So that allows the signal to sort of move in and get to where it needs to go. That's what T tubules do. The sarcoplasmic reticulum is smaller. Remember, sarcoplasmic reticulum holds on to calcium, okay? And we're going to see that there's a very big difference, and you're going to have to know this, between skeletal muscle and myocardium, and that is heart muscle, and that is that calcium will actually leak from the outside, or there are channels actually. It doesn't leak, there are channels that open when the muscle contracts, and we'll see why that is so significant. Okay, so but the sarcoplasmic reticulum itself that's inside here is smaller, and it can get away with that. Okay, mitochondria. Remember, the mitochondria, when we had like fast twitch and slow twitch, remember the slow oxidative had a lot more mitochondria, had a lot more myoglobin. There's a ton of myoglobin in cardiac muscle, and there are a lot of mitochondria. They're everywhere because what is mitochondria doing? It's making ATP. And do you think your heart needs a lot of ATP all the time? Yes, it has a good blood supply. It has a lot of mitochondria. It's making ATP constantly, as efficiently as it can. It doesn't want to do glycolysis where you only get 2 from a glucose. It's doing it the best way where you get, the 36 to 38 ATP per glucose. So it's very efficient, makes a lot of ATP as efficiently as it can. It's fine-tuned for it, and therefore it has a ton of mitochondria. Okay, so let's talk about valves. All right, so there are, first of all, this is the thing to know right here. The valves ensure one-way flow. Okay, so that means that as blood builds up here, and we kind of mentioned that before, as blood builds up here in this atrium, okay, it will, when the pressure builds up, it will push blood through into the ventricle, and here is a flap valve. Okay, so this is called the bicuspid, or also it's called the mitral valve. It's called the mitral valve because there's something called a mitre that bishops wore, and whoever discovered it thought that it looked like that, but it has 2 cusps, or 2 flaps. Okay. Over here, you have the tricuspid valve, which has 3 flaps. Okay, and I'm going to name these on the next slide anyway. But just to give you the idea, this is what we're talking about. And then up here, you have these things called semilunar valves that right here, and one's behind the other in this picture. But you have semilunar valves. So what happens if we come up here to where the picture's a little bit bigger? So we can see that as blood builds up here, the pressure is going to increase, and let's say that the ventricle starts to relax, this pressure will push those valves open, and blood will then flow into the ventricle. Okay? So then, after blood flows into the ventricle and it disappears from the atria, when the ventricle contracts, it's going to, now we didn't see it, but this valve had been open, and then when this starts to contract, it's going to push those valves back closed again, and it's going to force these semilunar valves open. Okay, and that's what it does. It doesn't let the blood, so if the blood just flowed in here by forcing those valves open, well, when this contracts, it's going to push on those and it's going to force them closed, and that's going to make the blood go out here through this direction. It won't let it flow back. If it does flow back, we call that a prolapsed valve, or an insufficient valve that's not working right. You might hear a heart murmur or something like that, okay, because you hear the blood squishing past, and it's not supposed to do that. Okay, not significantly anyway. Okay, and the other thing you see here are these little things called chordae tendineae. So much pressure is built up in the ventricles. You don't see this. You don't see the chordae tendineae with the semilunar valves, but you do with the AV valves, the atrioventricular, the ones between the atria and the ventricles. So in this case, we're talking about the left side, so it's the mitral valve. Um, you see this chordae tendineae and this papillary muscle that will actually contract and hold it so it doesn't, so when this contracts and it forces all that blood out, it doesn't actually just cause those to flap open the other way, because that would, like I said, that would be a prolapsed valve. That's not a good thing. So this holds on to it to keep it and forces it in the direction that it's supposed to go. So it is ensuring one-way flow. And this does the same thing. The blood moves into the aorta. Okay, so this time we're talking about the left side. So blood, oxygenated blood, is moving into the aorta. The aorta will expand, it'll stretch a little bit, which causes pressure. And then when this relaxes, you don't want the blood to just flow right back in, so these valves will flap shut. And that keeps the blood moving in this direction. Okay? All right, so let's name them. Semilunar valves. These are the semilunar valves. They're both under here. One is, they cross, okay? So you've got the left and the right semilunar valve, even though they're right here, but it's coming from, but the semilunar valve that's behind is actually on the left side. You can kind of see a little piece of it right here, okay? And so that's the left semilunar valve, and it's going to the aorta, okay? So guess what it's actually called? It's actually called the aortic semilunar valve. It's called a semilunar valve because when you look at them, and I have a picture of this, they close up all the way, but each flap kind of looks like half the phase of the moon or something. Somebody thought that they look like part of a moon, so they called them semilunar valves. Okay, so that's the way they kind of look. And there's a better picture in your book, and actually this picture was a little bit better. Well, actually, no, it doesn't show the semilunar valves, but you get the idea, and that's why they're called that. So, so in case you were wondering, I guess these look like parts of a moon if you use your imagination. Okay, so so those are the semilunar valves, and they're named after where they're going. Basically, the aortic, the semilunar valve, the aortic semilunar valve is going into the aorta, which means it's coming from the right side. Or the left side, I'm sorry, it's coming from the left ventricle through the aortic into the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta. The right one is going from the right ventricle, and it's going into the pulmonary artery. Okay, pulmonary means lung. Okay, so it's going to the lungs, and it's going away from the heart. So remember, artery away from the heart. Okay, and vein to the heart. Okay. Can't remember if I said that, but I did. I said it twice. Okay, artery is going away from the heart. So this is the pulmonary artery. It's going to, or the pulmonary artery. It's going away from the heart to the lungs. Okay, this is the aorta. Okay, and it forms all sorts of arteries going to the head. It's going down to the lower body. Okay, all right. So then the left. So the right, so now we have the atrioventricular, and they're called that because they're between the atria and the ventricles. Okay, the left atrioventricular is the one with two names. It's called the bicuspid or the mitral valve. Okay, and the right atrioventricular, see it has this chordae tendineae and the papillary muscle too, is called the tricuspid. And the way I remember that is like I said, it almost seems backwards, like this should be the one with three, but it's not. Okay, so the left one is the bicuspid or the mitral valve. Okay, so they open when the pressure is higher, when the pressure is on one side is higher than the other side. Okay, so what does that mean? So we understand that these valves are making blood flow in one direction, and that they're opening and they're closing constantly. Okay, so they're flipping open and then they're closing tightly. Okay, constantly. But what happens, this is kind of an important concept to understand, is that when blood flows through your vessels, it's flowing in something we call laminar flow, and it's flowing very nicely. Okay, so if you have a valve that's here, okay, and that valve is open, then the blood will continue to flow through very, very nicely. Okay, so let's say the vessel continues. Well, then, if we draw it down here, okay, and we show that this valve is closed or slightly closed, well, then what happens is, of course, is the blood will start to, it's no longer able to have this what's called laminar flow, and it has to go around that. And what it does is it causes it to swirl. Okay? And that causes vibration. Okay? That's from turbulence. Okay? So, turbulent flow from the closing of the valves is what we can hear. Okay? So we can hear turbulent flow. Okay? And those are sounds. Those are the sounds that we hear. So that means that every time the heart beats and the valves flap open and flap closed, actually, that's when you hear it. You hear it when they close. So is this valve, so if we look at these valves here, when they're open, they're fine, but then when they flap closed, they cause a whole bunch of turbulence, and then that's what you hear. And then when they're closed all the way, of course, there's nothing on the other side. There's no blood flow on the other side, so you don't hear anything. Okay, so that's what you're hearing is the closing of these valves. I hope that makes sense, because there'll be a test question that says something about what causes the sounds, and it's turbulent flow from the closing of the valves. Okay, so there are actually four sounds. We only hear two. We hear those from the closing of the valves. The other sounds are also turbulent flow, but they're just flow from the filling and the emptying of the chambers. Okay, so we're only interested in these right now. Okay, so sound one and sound two. So lub dub, lub dub. So the first sound is turbulent flow, and this is what you need to know. If you just need to memorize it, that's fine. But as blood flows from the atria into the ventricles and the AV, the atrioventricular valves, which remember are the bicuspid and the tricuspid. The bicuspid is also called the mitral. Okay, hope you remember that. Those flap closed cause the turbulent flow, and that's the first sound you hear. And then, lub dub, okay, the second sound is after the ventricles push blood through the semilunar valves. Remember the aortic and the pulmonary valves, semilunar valves. After they push and those valves go closed, then there's also turbulent flow, and that's the second sound you hear. So the first sound, blood turbulence by closure of the AV valves, which are these guys, bicuspid and tricuspid. And then sound two is the closure of the semilunar valves, which are the aortic and the pulmonary. Okay? All right, and then sound three and sound four, just know that they exist. I'm not going to ask you what those are from. Okay, so we've kind of gone through everything. So I just want to go through this, and you're going to have to memorize this and remember it. It's in your study guide, but you're going to have to know this. And you can pretty much start anywhere, because remember, it's a cycle. Blood is flowing through as a cycle. So we have to understand how blood is flowing through the heart, including the valves, and and I have these listed here, including some of the vessels that are associated with it. I mentioned that at the beginning. Well, this happens to start at the right atrium. Okay, remember the right side is deoxygenated. Okay, so that means blood is coming in through the vena cava and going to the right. Wow, you can't even see that. I don't really want to use red though. Okay, so it's going into the vena cava. I'll just use a neutral color all the way through, and you can just remember the right side is deoxygenated and the left side is oxygenated. Okay, so it goes in here from the vena cava. Okay, and then it's going to flow through the AV valve. Remember, the right side, that AV valve is called what? It is called the tricuspid on the right side. It's the tricuspid. And then, after the blood gets in here, the ventricle is going to squeeze it out. And this is where you just sort of have to use some common sense. Well, it's on the right side. It's got to be deoxygenated, so therefore it's going to go out to the lungs. And then from the lungs, so that means it's going through the pulmonary, semilunar valves, through the pulmonary artery. It goes to the lungs where it picks up oxygen. it comes back through the pulmonary veins, okay? So it's going to go into the left atrium through the pulmonary veins, and then it's going to go into the left atrium, okay? So now it's oxygenated, and then from there it goes through this AV valve, which is the bicuspid, and then the left ventricle. It moves into the left ventricle. From the left ventricle, it moves through the aorta and then out to the body. Okay, so go over that a bunch of times. You have to know this entire thing. Okay.